All right, thank you so much for coming. We'll go ahead and get started. My name's Carl Levan. I'm chair of the Department of Politics, Governance, and Economics here at American University. Before I give a few opening thoughts and introduce a distinguished alumna, I want to give a big thanks to the staff who helped pull this important event together. Shanza and Jessica and Anne-Marie and Alice. It's been a real team effort within the department and across the school, and everything that goes smoothly tonight, you can have them to thank, and anything that gets bumpy, you can suppose blame me. I want to say three very quick things. One, I want to say that we live in an age of autocratization, that dreams of development, shared strategies for security, and humanity's march for healthier, longer lives has been disrupted by dictators around the world. For the first time in 20 years, autocracies outnumber the number of democracies worldwide. Roughly 72% of the world's population now lives under autocratic rule, and this is the highest share living under a dictatorship since the 1970s. The Economic Intelligence Unit recorded a drop in the global average of democracy score, making it the lowest ranking since they started reporting the level of democracy in 2006. Freedom House measures the average level of global freedom at the lowest level since 1985. This brings me to the second thing I want to talk about, which is that democracy is bigger than America or any single country. So how did we get here? In that same year, 1985, in his State of the Union address, President Ronald Reagan said, quote, "We must stand by all of our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives to secure rights which have been ours from birth." He called for a global defense of democracy, saying, quote, "We're here to stand, and proudly so, for all who struggle to break free from totalitarianism, for all who know in their hearts that freedom is the one true path to peace and human happiness." So how did we get here? It's not about the failure of democracy to deliver, a topic that I explored in my first book, and that we know that democracies deliver 20% higher economic growth, 94% less infant mortality, and that democracy is even more important than the level of development to explain levels of declining disease mortality, and so on. Nor is this about the decline of democracy necessarily because of people's attitudes. Over 90% of Europeans, for example, say democracy is the best system, and up to 70% of Europeans say they are satisfied with democratic performance. In Africa, the continent that I've spent much of my career studying, the demand for democracy has risen to 70% across 39 countries. Many problems got us here: populism, polarization, institutional mistrust. Today, we are focusing on foreign aid and America's departure from a bipartisan commitment to foreign aid dating World War II. We'll be hearing about the Global Democracy Coalition's report, which highlights that 97% of U.S. aid covering democracy, human rights, governance, and peace building has been terminated, impacting 1,600 grants across 129 countries. As you'll hear from the panel, the report focuses only on the impact of such cuts, pointing out how they have emboldened dictators, devastated America's power of persuasion through soft power, and made ethnic, gender, and religious minorities more vulnerable. But I would also highlight the perilous process that made those cuts through impoundments of congressionally appropriated spending, seizure of private property, and executive orders that circumvented Congress's powers under Article 1. This event is the second in a series on globalizing democracy protection, where we analyze democratic erosion abroad alongside threats to democracy at home. The third thing I want to say is, what can we do? For those of us who are waging peace in the School of International Service, We may challenge Reagan's militarism or question Ronald Reagan's ideas of universalism, but we always answer the call for democracy and human dignity. Through the global governance, politics, and security degree here in SIS, students study how economic interdependence can drive development instead of enabling authoritarian statecraft. We study how multilateral organizations can promote democracy instead of protecting dictators. And we study how we can reduce polarization with better tools to counter misinformation. I want to welcome students in my practicum class tonight, sitting up here in the front row, who've been doing research for International IDEA all semester long as a capstone project for their master's degree. And I want to conclude by saying that SIS alumna, who's here tonight, Catherine Baker, answered that call for democracy. She's Managing Director for Strategic Partnerships and Communications at OneAid. And when USAID came under attack, she did what SIS students do. She answered the call. And she's going to talk a little bit about how our students and people trained by SIS rise to the global politics challenges of the day. OneAid is a grassroots organization formed in the wake of USAID's dismantling, and it works to sustain the power of the U.S. foreign assistance community, including through advocacy on Capitol Hill. So with that, I want to turn the microphone over to Catherine. Great to see you again.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to Professor Levan for inviting me back here to my alma mater. On the evening of January 20th, the Trump administration issued an executive order titled Reevaluating and Realigning United States Foreign Aid. In the days that followed, those of us in the USAID and larger foreign assistance community had our livelihoods, careers, and characters assaulted by tweets coming from the richest man in the world. The media couldn't keep up with rapidly moving events. The zone was successfully flooded. Members of Congress had no idea what was transpiring, and their inquiries to the administration went unanswered. While confusion and havoc reigned supreme in offices and signal groups across the world, the foreign aid community banded together to disseminate breaking news, share information, and inform Americans from all walks of life as to the impacts this reevaluation was having, both at home and overseas. By February 5th, organizers planned a rally for foreign aid on the Hill. A few hundred people were expected to attend. 3,000 professionals from the USAID community showed up. A new grassroots movement of foreign aid advocates had emerged, unified in a desire to protect not only the Constitution many swore to uphold, but also the communities that we served. Since January, we've been asked by the media, members of Congress, friends, and family, what did you actually do and what does that mean? I soon realized I was killing my listeners with jargon whenever I responded to these questions, and I didn't think that it was jargon. Surely peace building or countering violent extremism are straightforward terms. The words may be straightforward, but the impacts of democracy, rights, governance, and peace building, DRGP, our first acronym for the night, programming are more nuanced to communicate and therefore to understand, especially when demonstrating direct benefits to the American people. In February and March of this year, much attention was given to, quote, life-saving aid. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said it would not be impacted by stop work orders and would be prioritized in his review. Good news, I thought, for my colleagues in humanitarian assistance or health, but likely problematic for us in DRGP. According to a report published in May by the Pew Research Center, 83% of Americans say the U.S. should provide medicine and medical supplies to developing countries, and 78% are in favor of food and clothing aid. The number of Americans who believe in aid for strengthening democracy drops to 61%. As we saw in the Global Democracy Coalition report, 97% of USAID DRGP programs were eliminated, more than any other sector at the agency. Delivering medical and food aid becomes exceedingly difficult in conflict areas. or areas lacking functioning governance structures. It isn't difficult for us to imagine how corruption, lack of transparency, or poor service delivery can negatively impact these life-saving efforts of ours. Why does this work receive far less popular support when we know how critical it is within the foreign aid ecosystem? When trying to explain the need for foreign aid the past 10 months, many of us have been posed the uncomfortable questions. Why should Americans care, and what's in it for us? When the foreign aid review was announced, companies like my former employer were tasked with explaining to the US government how the work they contracted us to perform made America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. Reading this report, you'll see that the arguments to Secretary Rubio, himself a longtime proponent of foreign aid, must have failed to resonate. Lawmakers are putting into action such drastic cuts to foreign aid because they can, and they are unlikely to lose significant popular support over it. A false narrative has been promoted that if we spend money overseas, that means less for our communities here at home. We need to repackage the arguments we presented to the US government and take them instead to the American people. I'll end with this. During this year's annual West Wing rewatch, which is my comfort show, and maybe many of yours as well, Danny Concannon's words rang out louder than ever before. According to Danny, nobody wants to put money in a hat in Botswana when you got hats that need filling here. We can't make this about charity. It's about self-interest. We cut farm assistance in Colombia, and every single crop we developed was replaced with cocaine. We cut aid for primary education in Northwest Pakistan and Egypt, and the kids went to madrasa. Why aren't you making a case that certain politicians are bad on drugs and bad on national security? I assume the vast majority of people in this room would consider themselves foreign aid advocate. In an America First administration, we need to better articulate why this work matters, because no government wants to be seen as bad on drugs and bad on national security. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for everything that you do. I don't have much more to say for now. I'm just going to introduce Jonathan Kamen, who retired from USAID in a very timely way in November, December of last year, and he's affiliated with the Department of Politics, Governance, and Economics. Before he came to us, he served as mission director in Rwanda. He also oversaw work in Sudan and South Sudan, and worked as deputy mission director and acting mission director in the West Bank and Gaza, and also served in Moscow. He has a broad range of development work, and he'll be introducing the panel. Come on up here, and he will we'll start with a quick presentation from the authors of the report.
Thank you, Carl, and thanks for that nice introduction. That's more than I thought was going to be shared. Anyway, it's a real honor for me to stand up here and be part of this this exercise, I would say. It's been, and thanks to Catherine and fellow USAID alumni for the great work you're trying to do to really bring up the herd attacks. It's been quite a 9-month period, 10 months, not sure how long it's been. Really, I came on board here a year ago, and could never have imagined kind of what I would be thinking or saying a year later. Who could have imagined that? But here we are. But it's an honor to kind of stand up here, and I want to introduce kind of our first speaker presenter, really on whose paper this evening is really founded, Annika Silva Leander, who's really kind of the key author for the Win Aid Fades paper. Before I give you her short bio and bring her up here, I do want to say a word or two about what struck me about the paper as you read it. It's an important, there's been a lot of work that's been done to try to understand what the heck happened. What happened? Where are we going to go? But this paper really takes it to a whole new level of kind of exploration and analysis that's so desperately needed. So we can speak facts about what this impact has been. And I think that what's particularly important is probably not so much just the facts that we read, of which there are plenty and useful, but it's clear that this was an important collaborative effort for you. And this brought in many important voices that work with you on this, and that's really kind of probably everything that's needed right now. And I want to say that it seems to me that clearly the cuts in development have hurt all aspects of development for here in this country and around the world for sure. But it's one thing to kind of analyze the impacts this has on something like health, where it's easy to kind of measure the facts and figures about inoculations not given, or clinics closed, or disease that spread, or even death that happens. You can measure these things and kind of feel it. But when it comes to measuring the impact that cuts have had on democracy, governance, peace building, these kinds of hard topics, as we all know in this room, it's tough. It's really hard to kind of pull together what is the data. But we all know that these programs, and this is certainly I'm speaking to from the rich experience of my time working with USAID for almost 20 years, time working before that in civil society, it is the foundation for everything that follows from it. Economic growth, education, health, you name it. If you don't have functioning societies that can kind of support this stuff, it's not, as we always say in the USA business, sustainable. And I think that's really the beauty of this report. And I think that what's important is we'll hear from Monica in a minute here, is that it sheds a light, not just on where we've been, but on where we have to go. And not just critical, but with ideas of where that road can take us. So I think it's really a remarkable stepping stone for good conversation tonight and beyond. If I can say, Annika Silva Leander, the head of the North America desk at International IDEA, where she leads the outreach and partnership across the US and Canada, engaging with civil society, think tanks, academia, global affairs, Canada, and the United Nations. She also coordinates the Global Democracy Coalition and serves as International IDEA's permanent observer. Fast, I don't want to get to the subject at hand here. She's the IDEA's permanent observer to the UN, advancing research and advocacy in the links between democracy and sustainable development. She's clearly a recognized scholar and speaker on global democracy around the world. Before joining IDEA, she worked for a decade at the World Bank on civic engagement and poverty reduction in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and held positions with UNICEF, UNDP, and the Vida Foundation. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you up to the podium to present on the report. And I'll come back and introduce the rest of the panel as well. So Annika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming here. Thanks to Carl and to American University for inviting me here today, and for giving me the opportunity to present the key findings from our report on the impact of the foreign cuts on the global democracy, rights, governance, and peace building sector. Thanks, Carl, also for inviting me to collaborate with you and work with your students on the practicum course. I'm learning a lot from them, and I'm so happy that you're here today. I just before I go into what we found and why we did this study, I wanted to also thank people that have been critical to this report. First, the Global Democracy Coalition and all the partners in the Global Democracy Coalition. It's 168 organizations, democracy organizations throughout the world that have all contributed with their testimonials. They have almost all been affected by the cuts. So this has been a truly collaborative effort. Warm thanks also to Courtney Pompey, who's here. She's the co-author of this report, one of the co-authors, and this report wouldn't have been possible without you. So thank you, Courtney, for working with us on this report and for being here tonight. I also wanted to thank IFES and Cassie Emmons, who joined us to contribute IFES perspective on the electoral assistance sector. I don't know if anyone from IFES managed to come tonight. Kathy is out of town, but it's been great to collaborate with IFES on this. We realized when we were about to launch the surveys, IDEA was going to launch a survey and IFES was going to launch a survey to assess the foreign aid cuts impact on the democracy sector. When we realized we were both doing the same thing, we decided to join forces rather than duplicate. And that's quite unique because we often tend to duplicate rather than work together. And that's something that I think we need to change going forward. So it's been really great working with IFES on this. Finally, I just wanted to say that this report really is a tribute to democracy defenders all over the world. Those that gave to the cause in USAID, in the State Department and all those democracy champions around the world that continue to defend democracy everywhere, and now under a lot more strain and repression than ever before. So this report really is dedicated to all of them, all the viewers and you are here. There's been, like Jonathan mentioned, a number of studies that have looked at the impact of the foreign aid cuts on health and the humanitarian sectors, and those impact studies have been critical. But as you said, it's easier to quantify the impact in the health sectors. You count the number of clinics, you count the number of vaccinations that have been lost due to the cuts. With our sector, the democracy sector is just much harder. And that we try to do our best to capture these impacts qualitatively and quantitatively. So let me make sure that I know how to work. I just wanted to start very briefly with why we did this and what the objectives are. I mean, soon after the aid cuts were announced, and then first the freeze and then the final decision on the cuts, the cuts being so massive across all the sectors, we really wanted to understand what impact is this having, especially because we knew working in democracy, that democracy has been on the decline for many years, civic space has been shrinking. So what do these cuts imply for the sector and for the ecosystem in an already very weakened context? So what we wanted to do is to provide the sector, what we call the DGRP sector. So it's broader than just democracy, rights, governance. We also look at peace building, to provide really as much of an evidence-based picture supported both by data, but also testimonials and voices from around the world on the state of the global democracy ecosystem following the aid cuts. And what we hope this will do is to provide insights into how democracy organizations and international institutions throughout the world are navigating this new funding landscape, how they sustain and also rethink democracy's support in this new context. We also hope that it can provide insights into how the scarce resources that remain should be targeted and where they should be targeted going forward. Also, the unforeseen consequences of the foreign aid cuts for global security. We'll talk about that in the panel after also. And also some insights into how democracy assistance helps to underpin other foreign aid cuts and therefore why it's so critical. A few words on the data sources that we drew on for the report. There were four major information sources. One was quantitative data on the US foreign assistance cuts. This has been the hardest part of the report to get hold of because much information and most information has not been made publicly available, particularly the cuts to the State Department awards. There's been more information circulating, not necessarily publicly, but amongst the community on the USAID cuts. State Department awards have been much more difficult to get information on, also because there's a lot of flux. There's been decisions that have been reversed and then projects that restarted, and it's really been hard to get a clear picture of the cuts of the State Department awards in the sector. So any potential errors have to be read with that caveat in mind. We also, as I said, did two global surveys that informed the study, one done by IDEA and the other one by IFES. They were conducted in May this year, and together they covered 276 DRGP organizations throughout the world in 86 countries. They covered a range of organizations, both international, national, and local civil society organizations, for-profit contractors, international organizations, academic institutions, think tanks, and foundations. We also did a range of semi-structured interviews with a variety of organizations from different regions that have been impacted by the cuts to hear their testimonials. And then we also did a desk review. We looked at policy reports that have been done on different subsectors of DRG and also news reports. So some of those subsector reviews and surveys that were done by Humanity United, covering the peace building sector, UN Women, covering women's organizations, Outreach International covering LGBTQ plus communities, Kairos covering civil society, and Internews that looked at the independent media sector. Okay, so let me turn to what we found. Start with the financial data, and then I'll talk about some of the qualitative feedback. But just a reminder that before the cuts, until this year, the US was the largest bilateral aid donor in the world, with average annual disbursements of around $63 billion per year, accounting for a quarter of all official development assistance. It was distributed through a number of agencies. USAID had the largest portfolio, followed by the State Department, but also 8 other agencies were distributing these funds. What we found is that around 86% of all USAID awards were terminated for a total value of $75.9 billion, and that the State Department terminated around 2,000 awards for a total of $4.6 billion. As Jonathan said, there were cuts across all sectors, including in humanitarian aid, also in health, in education, agriculture, water and sanitation, social protection, trade and private sector development, and then democracy support, which was the most affected sector in terms of the number of awards cut. So if we go to the DRGP sector specifically, we estimated that more than 1,600 DRGP related US funded grants were cut. That includes both USAID and State Department grants for an estimated value of $14 billion. This represented around 70% of the entire DRGP portfolio. 97% of USAID DRGP awards were cut, and around half of the State Department awards, affecting 129 countries from all regions of the world, democracies of all kinds, and hybrid regimes, authoritarian regimes, and thousands of CSOs. So what's left? Well, it's estimated that 3% of the USAID funded DRG related projects were preserved. Of the State Department projects that were preserved, they were for much smaller amounts, even though there were quite a few that were preserved. Many of them are set to end soon, just with the information that we were able to get. And there doesn't seem to be a clearly articulated strategy for continuation, what's going to happen after those projects are terminated. And if there is no continuation beyond these projects, what will be left is NED, congressionally funded, which provides $286 million in civil society grants in more than 90 countries, and also supports its 4 core institutes, including NDI and IRI. But we know also that NED has faced challenges this year. They had their funding frozen. They had to do a lawsuit, and then which forced the release of their funding, the remaining funding for this fiscal year. We're still awaiting the funds for next year. I think what has been particularly devastating beyond the US cuts, which were devastating in and of themselves, given that the US was such a large funder, but it's also that they have coincided with other countries for an aid cut. So soon after the US announced its aid cuts, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK and Canada also now announced cuts of their own to rein in fiscal spending and to cover and to respond to higher defense costs. So a total of 11 OECD countries have announced cuts for 2025 through 2027. So OECD projects a 9 to 17% drop in ODA in 2025, and that's on top of a 9% drop already in 2024. But there is a difference there in the cuts, the US cuts versus the other countries' cuts. I mean, in the case of the US cuts, they were announced literally from one day to the other without no forewarning. All these other countries that are cutting, they are doing so over a period of years 2 years with a clear and gradual plan so that organizations can adapt to this new funding reality. And I think that's a very, very critical difference. I think also what has happened, and that's been particularly damaging for our sector, is that when donors impose such broad, also cross-sectoral cuts like they have done now, democracy assistance tends to be sidelined and to be the first victim, because the little resources that are left tend to go to these visibly life-saving sectors, for example, health and humanitarian aid, or although they have also experienced very significant cuts. Okay, so let me go to some of the survey results here. So 276 organizations that we surveyed across 86 countries. More than 80% of them reported DRP-related funding cuts of those that chose to answer the survey. There was clearly a self-selection there. But what happened for many of them is that many of them were heavily dependent on US aid. Almost half of the respondents reported that US funding represented half or more of their organizational budget. What we also saw, and that was quite interesting, that the local organizations, they had a lower dependence than the US organizations. I think that if I have the right data point on that, at the time of USAID's closure, around 12% of its funding went directly to local organizations in the Global South. Around 40% of the organizations in the survey reported a loss of more than half of their overall budget, and most of them have been unable to replace the funding. The themes that were reported as most impacted were, by the survey respondents, were anti-corruption projects, support to independent civil society, youth participation projects, human rights protection projects, capacity building, and gender equality programs. 42% of respondents say they have experienced cuts from other donors at the same time. 65% of organizations have had to lay off staff, more than half are downsizing, and almost 70% said that they have reduced programs or services. Almost 40% have also reduced the staff pay of those staff that they have been able to keep. Accountability Lab, they have done a series of surveys in January, 4 rounds of surveys of the entire aid sector. Their latest survey was done in October, ours was done in May, and their latest survey shows that 38% of all aid organizations are at risk of closure, and that's up from 28% in July. So let me go to some of the other impacts that we have seen also from this work and from the research that we did for the report. We identified both direct effects of the cuts and also some indirect effects. I'll start with the direct effects. And the first set of direct effects really are on civil society and civic space, because so much of the funding went directly to civil society. And this is, as I said earlier, it's so devastating because these cuts are happening in a context where democracy was already on the decline in many places. Authoritarianism was gaining ground, a number of countries were backsliding, and there was already a shrinking civic space. And we have documented that. International IDEA has documented that. Freedom House has documented that. VDM has documented that. So these cuts are occurring in a context of vulnerability for civil society, and also intensifying repression in countries already on the backsliding path. So really the first impact that we are seeing is the erosion of civic infrastructure that these cuts are causing. They have accelerated a global contraction of civic infrastructure and hitting thousands of CSOs and creating what really many describe as an existential crisis for civil society. And the result of that is a weakened pro-democracy ecosystem facing authoritarian pressure with fewer resources, less protection for vulnerable groups, and diminished capacity to hold power to account. And the damage is most acute for groups operating in or in exile from repressive, authoritarian contexts, many of which were heavily dependent on US aid and support. And the stakeholders that are most affected are those operating in or in exile from countries that have less geopolitical importance than others, for example, Myanmar, because it's very hard for those stakeholders, both in civil society and independent media, to access alternative funding sources as donors withdraw. Now, for example, the Belarusian democracy movement, they've also suffered from the cuts, but because they are in the European neighborhood, they can access European funding in a way that Myanmar, Burmese civil society organizations and independent media outlets cannot. And the second point is reduced US engagement has coincided with intensified state repression in a lot of places, intensification of legal restrictions, and a delegitimization of civil society. Governments that were already on the backsliding path have exploited civic actors and reduced external scrutiny, expanding this foreign agent rhetoric that we've heard in many places, for example, Georgia and El Salvador. And we've heard similar narratives also in Hungary and Slovakia. What we saw through the report was that new legal constraints, civic space, have appeared in 30% of the countries of that IFES surveyed, with dormant restrictive bills revived and previously unenforced regulations reactivated. In 2025, a number of countries have also passed foreign agent laws that governments previously had tried to pass, but because of diplomatic pressure, they had to be withdrawn. They were put back for approval and now passed without little international criticism. And many of the informants that we interviewed, they very clearly associated the passing of these laws with the reduced US pressure, because US was such a strong voice when those types of things happened, and that the rest of the international community simply isn't as vocal and as bold to denounce such actions when the US is not there to back them. Third point is, in terms of the impact, is how they have really disproportionately affected vulnerable groups. We see very clearly, and from a number of reports that have been done on this, for example, UN Women, the report that they did on women's organizations, they reported that 60% of women's organizations in crisis-affected countries have been forced to suspend or reduce services for survivors of gender-based violence, leaving many without access to shelters, legal aid, or safe spaces. And they estimate that almost half of women-led or women's rights organizations in 44 countries expect to shut down within 6 months if they are not able to replace the funding. Human rights defenders have also been among the most severely affected by the funding cuts, as the closure of most rapid response and protection programs supporting defenders and religious minorities and LGBTQ+ communities in authoritarian settings, which have seen closure of shelters, of legal aid and security assistance removed, and leaving activists and marginalized groups exposed to escalating repression, facing intensified surveillance, threats, and violence. So LGBTQ+ organizations, for example, such as Uganda, have not only lost the essential services, but they are unable to replace those funds because they cannot mobilize that funding, at least domestically, and other foreign funding is also drying up. The ripple effects of the aid cuts are being felt acutely in the peace building sector also, where diminished resources are already constraining conflict prevention and stabilization efforts. Worldwide, Humanity United did a survey. They found that 70% of peace-building organizations have reported reduced funding, and around half expect to run out of funds by next month. A further consequence of the aid cuts is the erosion of trust between civil society organizations and the communities they serve. And the Carter Center, you documented that. There are several others that have documented this. Really, the abrupt interruption of essential services, and this goes beyond also the democracy assistance work, but also the abrupt interruption of essential services in health, education, and so on, has really strained trust relationships between local organizations and the communities they serve. And they blame the local organization rather than the more distant donors. And this undermines the perceived reliability and legitimacy of pro-democracy actors more broadly, and accelerates a broader decline in public trust in civic actors in places, for example, as Bangladesh and the other sector that has been severely affected is the independent media sector. Internews has done a study of the independent media sector. And we also interviewed a number of independent media outlets and journalist associations. There we see outlets shutting down in places like Sudan, Myanmar, El Salvador, Afghanistan, but even independent media outlets in Eastern Europe, in places like Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine have lost a lot of their funding. Some of them dependent on US aid for 40 to 90% of their funding. And so they've seen closed outlets, major staff losses, reduced investigative fact-checking capacity, and weakened safety measures, just at the same time that censorship and surveillance and disinformation pressures intensified. And I think what was very important also is that the US had neutrality requirements for these independent news outlets. And when you remove the funding, you remove those requirements and you open the space for actors that don't have those safeguards, including from Chinese interests. We interviewed several informants that said that Chinese interests had approached the independent media outlets to offer funding to replace. And we add to that the closure of US broadcasters such as Voice of America that compounds a weakening information ecosystem. I'll get to the end now. Carl is telling me to stop. There's so much to say, so it's hard to capture also all the impacts across all the various subsector. But just very quickly on the governance, justice sector, and anti-corruption sector, also a number of programs have been cut there, and this erodes formal and informal checks on state power. And we've seen also many governments parroting the rhetoric that we've heard here about waste, fraud, and abuse, applying those narratives to anti-corruption NGOs and watchdogs in the global south. Finally, just on electoral assistance, IFAS is not here, but they covered the electoral assistance impacts. I mean, the entire electoral assistance portfolio was wiped out, with critical assistance disappearing weeks before elections took place. And this coincides with rising threats from AI and cybersecurity vulnerabilities and so on. And they have also reduced electoral observation, international electoral observation, which forces domestic observers first to operate with less resources, but also with fewer safeguards and greater political risk. Very quickly, we've seen also a critical impact of the cuts on the multilateral system, on the UN system. We know that the UN is cutting there and reforming as a result quite significantly, but it's not just the funding that is impacting the UN, it's also impacting civil society's ability to have a voice at the UN. The US really played a critical role in enabling civil society organization a voice and a space in multilateral forums such as the UN. They no longer do that and give space for UN member states that are much less open to civil society participation to have their voice heard. So that is really a critical impact. I think what I will do is not to talk about the recommendations. I'll stop with the indirect impacts, and we can talk about the recommendations in the panel. But just in terms of the indirect impacts, we're seeing also particular concerns about US aid withdrawn in transitional contexts, because it's not just the DRGP funding that disappears, it's all the funding that has gone to health and education and economic development in transitional contexts, such as, for example, Bangladesh, now at a critical moment in their transition trajectory. And we know that when that kind of funding is withdrawn in these very aid-dependent countries, where foreign aid enable these countries to provide services to citizens and so on, that there will be a lot of public frustration against the government when these services are withdrawn. And I know that USAID had this initiative, Democracy Delivers, a few years before the closure, I know that if USAID had been around, it would have come in and provided a set of, cross-sectoral services to those countries such as Bangladesh that is on the transition path. And now not only are they not getting that cross-sectoral support, but that support is withdrawn. Okay, and finally, I mean, a clear indirect impact that we saw from the interviews with the key informants and that we read across the media as well is just that this beyond the funding cuts is the diplomatic withdrawal of the US as a defender of democratic norms around the world, and the vacuum that leaves in global governance. And unless other countries are stepping up and occupying that space, it will be occupied, and it's already starting to be occupied by non-democratic countries, China and Russia, that are already stepping in with funding and with diplomatic support to a lot of these stakeholders that have ailed from the cuts. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the panel.
Okay, thank you so much. There was a lot to digest, and let's get the panel up here. If you've not read the report, read it. There's so much more information and data, and it's kind of ways forward to dive into. Okay, without further ado, let's invite our distinguished panel up here. And I will quickly give you their bios, and then we can turn it over to our moderator, Carl, to kind of lead the way. Annika, we've already introduced. Susanna Campbell joining us on the stage here, the Provost Associate Professor in the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security here in school. Her research examines how international and domestic actors interact in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, focusing on the link between research policy, peace building, aid and global governance. Extensive research in Burundi, the DRC, Sudan, South Sudan, and East Timor. The author most recently, Global Governance, Global Peace, co-authored the forthcoming Aid and Conflict. Welcome her to the stage. Kizito Biafia is the Advocacy Director at Open Society Foundation, where he leads the foundation's work on multilateral engagement. He's also an SIS alum. Based here in Washington, D.C., he served in a range of roles at Open Society, Director of Campaigns. He led their global campaign, developed a new mechanism for philanthropy, Open Society's U.S. Policy Advisor for Africa, and the Program Officer with Human Rights Initiative. Before that, he worked at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. He co-founded the online forum for innovative writing and discussion on Africa's development challenges. Jonathan Katz joins us from the Brookings Institute, where he's a fellow in governance studies. He's the co-editor of the 2025 Democracy Playbook. He recognizes the authority in anti-corruption, national security, international development, and democracy expert. Jonathan was a senior fellow and director of democracy initiatives, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where he focused on free media, anti-corruption efforts, civil society support, and democracy promotion. Jonathan also served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Europe and Eurasia Bureau, my former bureau, where he managed and developed a multi-million-dollar assistance program focusing on democracy, anti-corruption, and good governance, and also economic growth and energy security. He served as a senior advisor at the State Department International Organization of Affairs, and he's also had a distinguished career serving in several positions on Capitol Hill as a staff director of the European Subcommittee on the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs, a legislative director for Congressman Robert Wexler, and most recently as a national security fellow for Senator Amy Klobuchar. And last but not least, our moderator for this evening, Carl, who has kicked off the evening here. Carl is the chair of the Department of Democracy, Governance, and Economics here in the school. His research covers a wide range of things. He's focused on political institutions, democratization, and governance. His latest book is Contemporary Nigerian Politics, Competition in the Time of Transition and Terror, Exploring Parties and Elections in Africa's Largest Democracy. He's a co-editor and author of many other kinds of articles, and a renowned expert on Africa and democracy, et cetera. So without further ado, Carl, I turn it over to you and discussion with the panel. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. And it's a pleasure to have you in the department. For those of you who are here in the School of International Service, Jonathan and the other fellows from the department will be socializing tomorrow upstairs from 4 to 5 p.m. So please come meet them. So thanks so much for that presentation. It's been a real pleasure to work with you this semester, and my students have really learned a lot from you. I want to start by picking up on something where you left off, which is on the idea of the impact on diplomacy. In this room, about 10 years ago, Jimmy Carter spoke, and he launched, and Jimmy Carter, of course, after he was president, launched the idea of international election monitoring. And the report notes that $770 million in funding for electoral assistance is gone. And so I'm worried not just about the direct effect on those organizations, but the indirect effect. You know, what message does this send about America's commitment to democracy? What does this tell us about how this aid cut is a sign of changing global norms or a statement of American values? And I'm wondering if maybe Jonathan might be up for taking that question.
Hard question. It's wonderful to be here and appreciate the opportunity to participate. And I have a little bit of a cold, so I apologize beforehand. But this report is so important. And as for Brookings, for those that are doing research on the impact of the administration's policies over the last several months, this data is so critically important to policymakers. Even putting on my old hat as a congressional staffer overseeing U.S. assistance for Europe-Eurasia, this is really important. So I just wanted to praise the co-authors and partners that pulled this report together, and AU and for you for having us here to talk about this conversation. And of course, this is it's a huge blow for democracy globally to have the largest democracy assistance provider in the globe step back from its commitments, pull out projects that were already ongoing, doing it in a manner that that put in jeopardy not only projects that were about to start, but those that were ongoing, leaving civil society organizations in an incredibly vulnerable position, but also doing it in a way that really, I think as you talked about, you mentioned just sort of election observation, but this has been U.S. policy, development assistance for multiple U.S. presidents, Democrats, Republicans, when I was on the Hill as well. So this wasn't it was a real shock to the system, not only for those that have worked in this space, but the fact that in some cases, you had a withdrawal from key supporters in support of this stepping back. And so that sent an immediate signal globally that the United States was stepping back from these commitments. It was mentioned the diplomatic step back as well, which we can go into a little bit more too. It's not only that assistance doesn't only come with dollars or technical support and the things that go with assistance depending on country, project, but also came with the U.S. backing and support. And I often talk about this because it was time and again where U.S. leadership not always succeeding, because it doesn't always succeed. I put that in there because I think it's important to know democracy, like defense and diplomacy, is challenging, sometimes successful, sometimes not. And in this case, so many of the projects that we worked on and efforts where the U.S. leadership or diplomacy was the essential element in achieving objectives on the ground, bringing together key partners and allies to focus on a challenging problem. And within just a few months, if you go back in somebody says 9 months, 10 months, it's hard to believe, you had a seismic change in sort of how the U.S. approaches not only development assistance, diplomacy, defense, intelligence sharing, trade. So what we're talking about today, and I was thinking about, I had to call them the 4 V's, which is, creating vacuums internationally, greater vulnerabilities. We can go into these, the victims of what has taken place, those that have felt the fallout of the U.S. withdrawal, and then the victors. Who's winning in this system? And some of you mentioned China and Russia. but also those that are benefiting from global systems that are no longer democratic or respect rule of law, and that includes businesses. And of course, what we're seeing in the United States, as we also focus on US democracy, is sort of the mirror image of the US withdrawal on rule of law, of combating corruption, of ensuring and addressing economic challenges of inequality, or these major global issues that impact Americans. We're seeing withdrawal at home of this administration too. So whether it's SNAP benefits that we heard a lot about over the last couple of weeks, or when we're thinking about healthcare. So it's a challenge, not only a domestic withdrawal from areas where there's been bipartisan consensus or engagement, but we see this globally. And I want to go into this particularly because I've been thinking a lot, looking through this about systems and systems breakdown. And of course, if you remove experts from within the US government in key departments and agencies, I was thinking about US intelligence in particular, and I think it's appropriate for this conversation to think about when the US disengages with partners and systems collapse within country, that it has a direct impact, not only those that are in the country, but also Americans. And I know we need to make that case. But I was, sort of rereading a piece because I had read, I've been thinking about it. I was a Hill staffer during the 9/11 attack and worked with those that were engaged in the 9/11 Commission report, thinking through how systems, when they collapse or when there's no sharing of information, when those safeguards are put in place, when they're removed, it increases the vulnerabilities of potential terrorism attacks, again, including the United States. I was thinking about Syria. There was an event here on Syria right before this. And Brian O'Neill, former CIA executive, wrote in Just Security, this is early this year, from the 1973 Yom Kippur War to the 9/11 attacks to the 2000 Iraq WMD assessments. I was a Hill staffer during that. Most intelligence failures have followed a familiar arc, flawed assumptions, missed signals, and poor coordination. And I think a lot about this community here too. You wouldn't necessarily make those connections about how these things impact the United States, US national security, and global security. So I think that this is a trend. It's certainly a self-made decision by this current administration to shift US policy. And certainly the response of partners, including in Europe and elsewhere, to reduce assistance was a response to that vision. However, I don't think that it's necessarily has to be a lasting trend or that it will be, because I think the case to be made for why assistance is needed globally is there for us to make that argument, and that there's still support, including in polling numbers. So I'm more positive and optimistic, and that obviously with this current leadership, I don't see those changes, but I don't think it's a lasting trend, and I think that the U.S. will eventually be back in supporting and providing assistance, maybe in different dollar amounts, in different ways, but it will be back.
Thanks. So I want to maybe just try to get a quick reaction from my colleague Susanna Campbell, reaction to that, or first impressions from the report and the presentation. And I definitely would like to come back to how Abe will come back, but I think we'll get around to that. And then it'd be great to hear a quick reaction from Casito Bianca, Open Society. So Susanna, is your mic working?
First of all, thank you. Thank you for the work. Thank you for the work. This is a huge, it's very important to record this, and it's really important to recognize what's going on. My quick reaction is I've been spending 5 years building a network data set of A vectors. It's one of the things that I do. We build data, and what we've been realizing, what we've been doing an analysis where in the data right now and in 2020, 2021, depending on how you count. And that when we look at where USAID was in these networks, actually USAID was quite peripheral. It wasn't a central actor that was connecting all of the networks. It was really on the side. But what we saw is that it was on the side, and there were a lot of organizations that were solely dependent on USAID. So we would expect that when you take an actor out of that's kind of peripheral in a network, that it wouldn't affect the whole network. It would only affect this kind of group of organizations that were highly dependent on USAID. And yet what we see is that when we remove USAID from the network fragments. That it has these kind of knock-on effects that you wouldn't think about. And that's because USAID was working with lots of different types of actors. And so it was creating a cohesion across these aid networks. And these are focused in conflict-affected countries. But creating cohesion that really goes beyond just those who are directly dependent. And so I guess I want to say that, like, the trends that what's happened in the past year in terms of the US withdrawal and then the subsequent kind of mimicry of other aid actors following the US government's lead follows a trend of fragmentation, of reduced focus on peace building, of fragmentation among member states that we've been seeing for at least 10 years, right? And longer. And so the kind of height of this kind of liberal democratic consensus in which this whole field emerged in the 1990s and really took hold in the 2000s, it's been declining. And so a lot of these patterns have been greatly accelerated over the past year. But part of what makes this so powerful is that it's building on trends toward greater autocracy, toward reduced independence for media, toward fragmentation of member states, toward competition among member states for allegiance with, governments that may actually be harming their citizens. So I think you told me to be quick, so I'm trying to be quick around something that's quite complicated, but these are patterns that began a while ago and that have been exacerbated. And I think it's really important to see this and to see the kind of broader effects in light of what was happening, and that there was no going back to the heyday of the 90s and the 2000s, and there certainly isn't now. And so kind of trying to reimagine, what is this aid infrastructure? What are these networks? Who is connecting with whom? What are new allegiances that need to be fostered? And thinking creatively in that space, I think, is part of where this field really needs to try to go.
Thank you. All right, Kazito.
Working. Thank you, and great to be here with all of you today. Thank you, Carl. Thank you again, Annika, for the presentation. And thank you for that wonderful report in the state of what's happening with the cuts. Just a brief note, as a former alum, it's great to be back here in this building. Although I was in the old building over there, so you all are very privileged with the new digs, so enjoy it. But a few quick things. The report is spot on. It very accurately describes the situation and what's taking place. It's something that we've been looking at the Open Society Foundations over the past year, along with other funders. Because we've been asked to see how we can step in and see how we can fill some of this gap, which is almost impossible, which I'll get into. But what I love about the report is how well it describes the scope and the scale of the problem. 70% of all DRGP, democracy, rights, governance, peace building awards canceled. You're looking at 14 billion there, and then it's extended further to 80 billion when you look at the total scale of what's being cut. But then the impact that this has on many organizations, from the flexibility for these huge awards that have been removed and what they're able to do going forward for their survival, but the important areas of work that they're taking forward. It's been a massive issue for us with the Open Society Foundations and philanthropy in general, because many of these organizations are also our partners. And so there's a question of how can we help be there and fill in the gap? How can we support these important ecosystems? But the difficulty being this huge gap is now there, and we can't be there in the same way that we used to. We have to make difficult choices about who to support, and that means that we're taking away from one to get to another. If you look at within private philanthropy, Open Society will give out maybe 1.2 billion a year, which is significant, probably second to Gates. And then you have a few other foundations that follow after that. That's no way coming close to these large sums that we're talking about. And so to the point around systems is that's where we're at now, is we're seeing that this is going to be huge and changing for the big systems that we work with on human rights, on democracy, of course, governance. But many groups will have lost out this year. But what this will mean for our world going forward is a big worry. You probably were there 10 years ago, which you're mentioning around the trends for which I will call the height of the civic space movement. If you remember, to take yourselves back to that time, we were worried about deregistration of groups. We were worried about legal challenges, NGO laws, resilience for civil society organizations. Take us back to where we are now, and the resources have fallen out. What will that mean for all of those gains that movement tried to do to shore up space for civil society? Look further even beyond that. What will this mean for the human rights space? If you look at Open Society has been the largest private funder on human rights for the last 15 years or more. And that's not saying a lot because, that's not our total budget, but that's across the private philanthropy space. I would say there's about 7 major funders, US funders who fund within the human rights space. But of course, the outsized one has been the US government. And now that's gone. What will this mean for the future of the rights work? The huge gains that have been made in civil political rights, some of this transition that we've been seeing towards socioeconomic rights, what we might see next year with the current administration that will push for a movement around natural rights. And then the huge gut we've been seeing that's been mentioned within the UN system, for example, the OHCHR also facing a 20% cut in funding. So all across the board, we're seeing a miserable state, miserable with this huge gap in funding, difficult in terms of the actors that are there to try to do something, and then how we come together to solve these problems. Within the philanthropic side, for example, we spent, I'll say about a year deliberating around what our actions will be. That I'm happy to share about that later on. But we're basically scratching the surface. And so I just say that because for me, this is why the report is profound, in that the state of the problem is severe, but what's worrying is the actions, priorities to address that are weak and limiting at the moment.
Yeah, thanks so much, even though that was a grim and very concerning picture. So I'm sure there are 1 or 2 things that Annika might want to respond to about some of the things that were just said. And I was hoping that we could maybe pick up on where the presentation was concluding, which is thinking about the indirect effects. I think parts of the report really highlight the number of organizations impacted and the amount of money that was cut. And you were starting to talk a little bit about those ripple effects. And this is something that Jonathan touched on as well, that the report, I think comments about the reduced ability of the United States to make credible commitments to its allies, for example. But I'm also thinking about the lack of cooperation it might receive on the ground in places where threats are emerging as a ripple effect. Another ripple effect, going 1 degree further from that might be the higher cost of security, perhaps as countries or allies in the long run become less willing to trust the United States or to ally with powers that have been aligned together since post-World War II. So what are some of those sort of second order and ripple effects that we should be thinking about beyond this immediate and concerning and dark moment that we're in right now? Who wants to take that one?
Can you hear me now? I think I covered some of them in my presentation. I don't want to repeat it, but one of the ripple effects is really what we've already discussed, the withdrawal of the diplomatic role of the US as a global norm setter and as a defender of democracy globally, and what that means for countries that were already on a backsliding path or was on an increasingly autocratizing path. But when the US was there as a watchdog in a way, they maybe refrained from the most severe form of repression because they wanted to maintain good relations with the US. And without that pressure being there, they are emboldened, they have more free reins to do things. And in some cases, they might even get the support of the US for some of the actions that they are doing. And that is really a ripple effect that is very, very severe and that compounds the funding effects of the withdrawal of the funding for so many organizations and for aid efforts. I mean, I was mentioning also the effects on the UN system. I think that is an effect that we didn't go into depth in the report, but it is really significant. I mean, the US has not just cut their funding to the UN, and Kizito was mentioning the impact that is having on democracy supporting initiatives within the UN system as a whole as well. But the UN Human Rights Council and so on, there's a forecasted 20% cut across the board, and the UN aid reform process has been launched in response to some of these cuts. But the US has also withdrawn from key agendas, global agendas that they had been strong supporters of. Like the US announced this year that they withdrew from supporting the 2030 agenda, which is a universally supported agenda. And they do in key global summits. I mean, the most recent one in COP, the US wasn't there. You have the California governor there, but you didn't have representation at the government level. In the Doha summit that I attended a couple of weeks ago, the US also was absent. So it's really a massive withdrawal just beyond the funding cuts. And since we work a lot with civil society in the UN context, is also what I mentioned in my presentation. Before the US was a strong supporter of providing space for civil society to engage in the UN, and it has become much more difficult in the past decade because we know that this trend of autocratization has been developing gradually over the last decade. But the US was there as a defender and was protecting those spaces and shrink. With the US no longer there, it's just going to become much more difficult for civil society to claim that space. And I think what we're seeing also is the ripple effects is on other countries, because other countries are in the process of negotiating their trade agreements with the US. They are really wary of being critical of the US and damaging those relations with the US. So they are keeping quiet because they're worried that any action or any statement that they will do is going to damage these ongoing trade negotiations and other relations with the US that are very, very fragile right now. And so I think that is really problematic, in addition to the aid cuts also that they have done. But let's also remember that it's a mimicking effect to some degree, but it's also due to the higher defense costs that now European countries have to take on. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. So. Okay, thanks. I think you're sort of right. I think there's certainly certain topics and areas, particularly climate change, which we haven't really jumped too deeply into, where, again, I think this isn't the first time that Trump has moved the US in the opposite direction of addressing these challenges. But when you really look at almost every global challenge that needs to be addressed, you see withdrawal from US leadership, in fact, pushing it in a completely different direction. So I think that's important. Trade as well, particularly as it relates to corruption, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FARA, sort of enforcing, and I think some areas that I would differ, somebody who worked a lot in the anti-corruption space, including working with USAID and the State Department as part of the Summit for Democracy. It was there was some significant progress being made in addressing financial transparency and integrity, including in the United States, putting in place a beneficial ownership system important to detect and prevent corruption and bad actors from planting their money in the United States, including people like Vladimir Putin. So I just want to say that policies matter from the administration. When they change those policies, they do have these ripple effects. We're talking about ripple effects. And of course, when we're talking about networks of autocracy, it's unhelpful to have policies that are actually emboldening the networks that are engaging in these bad actors. And it's quite worrisome to see the potential of the US government actually playing a role in opposite of actually, pushing against pro-democracy forces. We see this in Europe with engagement with political parties like AfD in Germany and support for other actors, and even pushing on European allies to say that they're the ones that are anti-democratic. So I don't think it's just a challenge of policies of not support for democracy. I think there's an active engagement in actually pushing back against democratic forces that we haven't seen globally before from the United States.
All right, so I want to ask a question, maybe drilling down into civil society a little bit. And I want to think about this moment in terms of where we are in the history of ideas. And some of you have referenced sort of this heyday of support for civil society that emerged in the 1990s. And part of the thinking then was that by supporting civil society as actors that were independent of the state, we were also somehow supporting economies and private sector activity, which was also independent of the state. So as I'm looking at, the arc of the last couple of decades, I'm wondering, should the private sector in these countries perhaps be worried? Does the withdrawal from civil society support around the world somehow say that the way the US is thinking about markets is also different? It might be a question for the open society guy. I don't know. In other words, free markets and independent civil society went hand in hand at some point. And if we've abandoned civil society now, what does that mean for free markets?
Question. And it's unclear. But what I will say about the role of civil society now and how that will change and what this means for markets. Let me first start with civil society and then get to that. And so with civil society, one is not to perceive it as the monolith or the traditional civil society that we saw that grew up in the 90s and before. In fact, what you'd find who is mostly at the forefront of change, social change, catalytic change these days are movements, social movements, whether online or offline. And they're more informal, more difficult to put your arms around, that this is that kind of formal group that we know of very well. And so that's where you see actually a lot of the dynamism and change. And I say that because while my previous comment was one of doom and gloom, that's where there is still always a bit of hope ahead with where change can happen. However, to the point around markets and engaging the private sector and what might replace the role of civil society traditionally within these countries, because civil society has had that important role of holding governments to account, being that free voice of independent media, as well as uplifting communities and vulnerable communities that often don't get the limelight at the end of the day. Important for transitions, political transitions within countries, but really being that soul and that conscience that most countries need. Going forward, that's where I see a problem, and that social contract breaking down, especially given the rise of authoritarian governments and where we are with the state in our world, because they have been looking for all the excuses they can find to be able to delegitimize that civil society space. And now you have more carte blanche to be able to do so. So in terms of constructive engagement that will be there between civil society and governments, that's where I worry about that and what that might be replaced with. Now, I don't see it automatically being the private sector. There is a question mark even within philanthropy and funders, how we navigate within this new space. Do we change some of our practices? See how we change some of our models so we can be truly transformational and meet the moment? That's still an open question that we're looking at. But with what the US, for example, is doing with tariffs and trade deals, that is looking at new relationships with governments that is now affecting all different kinds of relationships. So if we take the example of DRC, so DRC with the critical minerals deal that was done, that they're looking to continue to improve on and take to other places. In the past, civil society would have had a role with monitoring human rights violations, transparency, looking at the budget figures and trying to hold the government to account, but also on this side as well. That middle part, that's what we're losing at the moment. You see it also taking place in Tanzania now, through the difficult election that they've had. You would have had human rights monitors on the ground, electoral observers, maybe alternate forms of reporting and documentation. And you'll see this as well ahead in Uganda next month. That is also not there. So for me, it's an open question because we're still figuring things out. So it's not as binary, one replaces the other. But I still have some hope in the new form of civil society, social movements, and finding new ways to navigate and organize despite these difficulties.
Thanks so much. So I know Susanna wanted to say something and Annika wants to weigh in as well. And we'll have a little bit more chat and then we'll get to questions from the audience.
So thanks so much, Kazito, for taking us to what is emerging, not just what is going away. Because I think this is part of where, for me, where the empirical question is. I think that, you know, the US was already losing its influence via its aid. That part of the effect, what you saw going on in a lot of places was that even the decolonizing aid movement, coupled with increasing populism, led to people pushing back on aid as if it was definitely something that was doing good, and led to kind of push back against many organizations, whether civil society organizations, that were recipients of external aid. And so I think it's really important to see and frame this within a context that there were already many other actors playing the aid game and playing it in a very different way, where they were much more prepared to use it instrumentally. And this is not just China, right? This is Saudi Arabia, this is Turkey, this is UAE, this is Russia and all of its friends. I mean, this is what has been happening in the aid world. And now the huge withdrawal and complete, 360 in the US government's approach feeds into this broader environment. But I think this is important to realize for two reasons. Because one, it means that what was so destructive about what's happened over the past year is that there were plenty of actors ready and willing to just step in. They're like, thank you, I was ready for this. I've got all my supplies, now I can move in. But there were also many actors who had already been adapting to that. Social movements and new social movement infrastructure that had been taking hold. Organizations like civil society organizations that were highly dependent on one type of funding during the heyday that had already been looking for alternative modes of funding. Civil society organizations, say in the Middle East, who had figured out how to continue to pursue human rights-ish programming while maintaining their relationships with the government, right, and with other society actors. So there's a lot of innovation out there that can and should be studied and better understood to see what there is to support. I also think that I love the Newsom example. Actually, Gavin Newsom, he represented the US at the huge climate conference, right? He didn't, but he did. So part of what we're seeing is these state-to-state relations. Subnational diplomacy is a thing. Companies are being forced to engage more in political space because governments aren't doing it for them. this is the stuff to watch. And I think that's part of the interesting story, if not exciting story.
No. Picking up on, well, going back to your first question, which was whether the withdrawal of support to civil society, how that is impacting the private sector and their willingness maybe to invest in countries. I think maybe for the private sector, maybe the withdrawal of support to civil society is maybe not their main concern, but what we've seen is that the funding has been cut not just to civil society, but also to support to the formal democratic institutions and the judiciary sector in many countries, support to judiciary reform, anti-corruption reforms in a number of places. And so I think maybe that it might be more concerning for the private sector, because what they are interested in a place where they want to invest, they want stability, they want political stability. And they want rule of law, and they want a clear legal frameworks that are enforced, clearly enforced, and so on. And they're not going to get that in most authoritarian governments. And now, and I think something that we're doing at International IDEA, and I want to thank OSF because they funded me to go to Doha. I was the only one there, and I was so grateful that I was able to be that voice to remind the audience there in the UN summit in Doha that. And I was worried of doing that because we were in Qatar and I had the Qatari emir sitting in front of me there. But our data shows, and your data shows, Carl, that democracies provide much better enabling environments for business and for investment, and that democracies provide social and economic well-being in a much better and more predictable way than authoritarian regimes. And so we wanted to put the data out there to the audience of UN member states that were listening to this, because you had the likes of Qatar that were boasting about their social development outcomes, and they're right to boast about them because they have very good performance on several of the indicators, not only equality indicators, but on health and education, but they are really the outliers. And I wanted to remind the audience of that. And El Salvador, the delegation of El Salvador, they were boasting about their security achievements, how they have managed to make El Salvador safe again, but at a huge human rights cost, as we know. And so, so that's one thing that I wanted to say.
So that would be MESA, make El Salvador safe again.
Yeah. And talking about that slogan, actually, I just heard yesterday, because the political campaign is starting in Sweden now, there are elections in a few months. And so the right-wing extremist party in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats, they're supporting the government right now. They've adopted the slogan. So it's about making Sweden great again.
No.
Sighing, but they do have more creativity. But I just wanted to pick up one point that you were mentioning, Quisito, about the social movements and the force with which we've seen them coming out in the past couple of just weeks, both in Nepal and in Tanzania, and to protest against corruption and against repression, and that is absolutely a source of hope. And that is something that should give us hope, because even if democracy is on the decline, the belief in democracy as a system and the support for democracy among people and among civil society is not on the decline. And these social movements are proving that. But I also wanted to say that they are very important. Social movements are very important for creating immediate change. So they created a change of the prime minister in Nepal and so on. They place issues on the agenda in a very vocal way, but they are not as good at actually implementing change and implementing policies. And that's where formal civil society organizations come in, and not just civil society organizations, also government policies, obviously, that can actually give continuity to all that energy that social movements channel. I do want to emphasize that we need both. And something also that I wanted to mention is, I mean, philanthropy is playing such a critical role also, and you have much more ability to support those loser movements, and you provide core funding in a much more flexible way. I know that USAID was trying to pilot support to social movements just as they were closing with this Powered by the People, I think, project, which was just cut short a few months into its implementation. And I think it was such an important model because it was the first time that I've seen a bilateral donor actually trying to provide support to social movements. It's not easy, but trying to do that. And I know that Humanity United now, they're trying to convince other bilateral donors to do the same. It's not an easy thing to do right now, as everyone is cutting and everyone is risk averse. They're not getting a lot of support for that idea. But yeah, I'll stop there.
I think Kazita wants to say something, but I want to invite anyone who wants to ask a question to come and get ready to line up behind the microphone. And Kazita, why don't you move us towards closing out our discussion here? And I know one of the questions that will come up will be something about what does AID 2.0 look like? So I'm anticipating that question. Why don't you go ahead and respond?
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, because the comments just provoked just one thing I also wanted to share. And just on that one with Powered by the People, I was the OSF person helping advise USAID for developing that fund with Humanity United. And it's really unfortunate because we were actually on the precipice of doing something great. And it's a bureaucratic procedure slowed all and stopped all of that, which is many good stories get lost that way. But to Carl's earlier point, just to make sure I answered well on the question around private sector involvement and philanthropy, what you're actually finding is it depends and it differs also by geographies. So one of the things that we've seen that's been acute in the US has been what philanthropies can do to fund organizations within this chilling environment. And so you all are familiar with the attacks against us, but also many other philanthropies have removed funding from US organizations because of what they fear is about to happen or what is taking place now. And so you've already had a chilling effect take place here. What I worry then about with the private sector is how this then spreads elsewhere and how other countries adopt what's happening here to prevent foreign funding.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was also thinking about the private sector in terms of Catherine Baker's work with OneAid, that this is, could be part of the new coalition, the new political coalition would be to remind those middle scale actors of the value of rule of law or of the unpredictability of corruption and where they may seek to do business. But thanks so much. So please try to keep your questions concise so that we have a little bit of time to chat and get to know each other afterwards and enjoy a few snacks. If that's all right, Alessia, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much, Carl. My name is Alessia. I'm formerly with the National Endowment for Democracy. So I'm going to ask a question that Carl already asked. But Kizito, you mentioned that you have been, your organization have been developing a new strategy for the next year to adapt to the current environment. Can you elaborate on what kind of ideas for a new strategy you have in terms of operations or funding? And then if you feel that you can share this information, how can you elaborate on how the current climate within the United States is affecting OSF operations?
It's a good question. We'll take one more. Yeah, and then we'll have some responses. Thank you.
My name is Ruth Vesek. I'm a PhD student in the economics department. I used to work at the Center for Growth Development here in DC. I saw an interesting map during the cuts height over the summer that showed the impacts primarily at state research universities across the United States who partner with USAID beneficiaries as research partners. And with that in mind, I'm just thinking about for candidates for the next presidential election and how might they sell to the American people a renewed aid initiative.
Okay, who wants to start?
The OSF questions. And so thank you for that question. Also, thank you for the work you did at NED and lots of hugs for that as well too. So the new strategy to adapt to the new environment. It's not only us, but it's also a few other donors that are looking at this. but I would couch it as you've seen 3 pathways within private philanthropy in looking to see how we can respond to this huge cut with aid. And it's been something that has been bubbling up over a few years because we were looking initially to respond to decreasing ODA. But then what happened with USAID at the beginning of this year made us then really try to see how we can aggressively meet the moments. Unfortunately, all of us were not really able to provide emergency funding, except maybe, I think, MacArthur Foundation. For most foundations, what we did was make our funding as flexible as possible to partners. So of course, general support, but provide that, and long-term support, provide flexibility where we could. The 3 pathways that are emerging is there's a subset of groups, donors that are looking at the future of US foreign assistance. That's one pathway, looking maybe at a bipartisan commission or different ways to advance this. What we were told actually at the end of last year, whether it was a Harris or Trump administration, was that they were both going to look at prioritizing the localization. So we're really working on some of this now. We're seeing what we can do. Second, and this has been the popular response, has been to look at how can we unlock new mechanisms for development finance. And so this is looking at innovative finance mechanisms. You might have seen what Gates is doing with the Development Commission, what CIP is looking at, and a few other donors within the space, and Rockefeller as well too. And that's an approach that's emerging. Then third, what Open Society is doing, and this is part of the shift that we've made since the last year, truly trying in other ways to become a foundation for the global majority or global South, however you see it. And we're trying to prioritize local solutions, local perspectives. That means localization and locally led development. Just because these cuts have taken place doesn't mean we put back the same system that was there. There's been a whole movement for the last 10 years on decolonizing aid that's put forward a number of active and good solutions. And so we're trying to lean strongly into that, but then also influence other philanthropy to come along with us for the journey. There's a funders roundtable that's being developed that are looking at some of these options. There's a mapping that we've done looking at different ideas from remittances to what you've seen on mutual aid in Sudan. But we're not yet at the point of being able to provide support to these options at the moment. What we're trying to do is plan and see where we go with this next year. And then just quickly in how the current climate is affecting our operations, it is, we are being targeted publicly. And we receive letters like other foundations are receiving letters as well too. The way we see it is that we are very proud of the work that we do. And in tough times, difficult times, we need to be resilient. There's nothing that we're hiding. Everything, of course, we do is always above board. But what's important is how we stand with communities who are facing these attacks this time. We try not to make it about ourselves, but really how we can continue to be in solidarity with many of the groups and partners that we support. OSF itself has gone through a difficult transition over the last few years, and we're coming out of that. And there's a responsibility that we have for our world in making sure that we're there to help where needed. And so how we see it is that we are standing strong and will continue to do the work that we do.
And I just add up point two is that for OSF and others is that we've seen, and I know there's joint letters that the communities of foundations and others have come together. This particular sector, which I think is really important. And as somebody who's been tracking and monitoring different groups that have been targeted, whether it's lawyers or universities, I think one of the things that certainly has happened is the community that OSF is in has rallied around each other, which has really been important, particularly when you're being targeted individually for these groups to stand together. I just want to add that because I think it's admirable because we've seen other spaces and sectors where we haven't seen that collective effort to say our work is important, we stand together. An attack on one is an attack on all. Maybe that's not where you want it to go, but it's something that we've been looking at, these responses across the United States in different sectors. I just want to highlight that.
Got a couple more people lined up. Does anyone else want to address the question that was asked about them? Okay, great. So Ida, you're up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carl. Nice to see you, Kizito. My question is directed to Jonathan Cox from Brookings. So I'm currently working on a research with the Accountability Research Center on USAID funding flows on, for sub-Saharan Africa, especially on, their democracy, human rights, and governance strategy, the 2030 strategy. And from what I've found so far is most of the DRG funding were actually benefiting more of the US-based contractors, from universities to faith-based to non-NGOs and governments, government offices here. And so for all this period since 2009 to 2024, most of the funding were literally for Americans. So in your current, PBOP, do you think USAID was actually serving American interest? Because the localization agenda, as what I'm seeing, was not localized. The CSOs, the countries that USAID was funding, literally were the list of recipients of the funding. Most of the benefits were going to American institutions. So just your thought on that.
And well, so number one, localization certainly was an issue. It's probably less of a focus of this administration. It would certainly be the focus of how aid rebounds in whatever form that looks like. And I think there's been some important comments already. I can't really speak to that specific region. I've also haven't been at aid, so I didn't oversee that specific funding. But it's been a common concern, refrain from a number of both CSOs or citizens in a number of regions. So this isn't a new issue or challenge. It's something that the previous administration was, at least from looking from the outside inside, what they were doing was attempting to address that challenge. But I'm certainly not the expert who's been focusing on localization. There may be others here who've spent a little bit more time at sort of how that has worked and may have an assessment based on sort of data and information to actually give you an answer. I think that would be a problem.
We let somebody else.
Did you want to respond to Annika, and then we'll hear from Brian?
No, I'm not a specialist either on localization. Maybe former USAID colleagues can speak more to that. I mean, the data point that we found is that, we know that USAID and the former administrator was working very hard on the localization agenda and had set targets. They were difficult to reach. I mean, at the time of the closure, I understand 12% of USAID's funding was going directly to local organizations. But I just want to say that even though much of the funding might have gone to international NGOs, including US NGOs, they were sub-granting and working with local organizations across the world. And that data figure is something that we weren't able to actually gather, is how many sub-grantees did these US organizations have? I think the number would be huge. I think the problem is that the overhead was large and some of that money was staying in these organizations. I think that's something that could have been worked on, but I just wanted to make the point that much of that money was going to local organization, although not directly. I also wanted to make a point on localization, that if a new administration or the current administration and other donors also are moving towards localization, I think one of the things that we heard in the interviews is that, yes, it's good that more funding goes directly to local organizations. It's great that OSF is doing that. However, let's not completely leave international NGOs and global networks out of the picture, because they played a critical role in connecting these local organizations, both with knowledge, with expertise, with capacity building. And that network support is absolutely critical. So I hope that localization doesn't mean removing everything that was international, but keeping the good things.
Can I say something on that as a, I think to your point, the numbers are incredibly low, but what all of this tells us, and Zito, you also mentioned some of this as well, is that the business model of how aid actually works has got to change. And this is an inflection point of what's taken place in the last 10 months for the those that care about foreign assistance to take this moment to rise to the challenge of how to do this differently. It's not only about localization and the localization number. I tried to get to the sub-grantee amounts and it was just impossible with the type of data that we were had access to. But the point to me is, how do you pull in other interests to shift the entire business model? I mean, this is a business. As much as anybody would like to feel that it is not, it is. And so that how aid is done, how grants and contracts are, how the mechanisms for how they work has got to change in order to get what I think all of us would need by localization and locally driven solutions. And so that is really, I think, the inflection point that we're at, is that entire business model has got to change. And that's what we heard from the partners.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. I'm going to suggest that we hear from all three, the last questions quickly, and then we'll wrap up and have a few minutes to chat with each other here in the room. So Brian, go ahead.
Hey there, I'm Brian. Really appreciated the conversation on Aid 2.0. I just wanted to note that there is a group of people working at the current administration on what Aid 1.5 looks like. And if recent history and God is anything to go by, the immediate future of foreign assistance will feature looting and grift pretty centrally. And so my question is, how can those of us in this room highlight the ongoing and upcoming waste, fraud, and abuse without further eroding public confidence in the international assistance sector? Yeah, how do we do that?
All right, thanks.
My name is Deogracias Kawunde. I'm an activist and an organizer for the African Catholics and the whole African diaspora, mainly Continental African diaspora in the DMV, DC, Washington, Maryland. And I try to organize African diaspora for civic engagement, as well as inclusion for people with disabilities, especially bringing the use of technology, assistive technology and accessible technology. My question is that, given that there's a gap in the funding for development issues as well as elections, for example, in Africa, like Uganda, where I come from originally, why has the diaspora not been engaged much more than before? We have a chance right now to an opportunity to engage with the African diaspora, the new continental African diaspora, to fill in the gap where this is happening right now. How can we leverage the expertise, the numbers, and natural affinity to Africa, for example, the power of remittances, and they don't need much orientation about the issue in Africa. What's the opportunity here for us to, can we grab that opportunity and engage the African diaspora much more effectively? And I think Anika or anybody else can try to address the issue of electoral issues. For example, Uganda coming up on back of Tanzania debacle. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Stella.
Hi, I'm Stella. I'm a second-year master's student here, the Global Governance, Politics, and Security program. I had a question about how, for the currently in aid and the future of aid, we can mobilize private capital for development. I was able to attend a talk or a panel in Georgetown where they specifically talked about how private capital could be invested in Latin America and the Caribbean, but it usually gets ignored because it's that like middle child. That's how they called it. Because being trapped in the like middle income country, that it was mentioned as in there's better places where the private sector looks to invest or they want to invest more money. And it was interesting seeing how they were saying we can close this gap of how aid was declining and basic congressional aid being gone, and how we can tap into the private sector to fill this gap. So I just wanted to see maybe your opinion on that, or maybe some policy recommendations. Thank you.
All right, thanks. We've got 3 quick questions. Thanks for being so parsimonious. Number 1, the risks of corruption and graft with Aid 1.5 before we get to Aid 2.0. Number 2, how do we engage the diaspora more, especially on technology? And number 3, this question coming back to the private sector, especially from mid-size countries.
Okay, but I'll start us off, and thank you for those questions, Brian, Deogracias, and Stella. Very, very good questions. Gracias, I'll start with your question because I'm your fellow countryman as well. And yeah, that election worries me tremendously. And it's a tough one, what to be able to do, but you're right in terms of the importance of leveraging the role of the diaspora in being able to bring attention to some of these issues, but also have some of the right responses. There's another thing you mentioned, you didn't touch on, but you mentioned when you're introducing yourself that you work with the Catholic community as well too. And that's actually quite important with what we see ahead for aid development, but also multilateralism. Because believe it or not, but the Catholic Church, the Vatican especially, and Pope Leo are having an increasingly important role when it comes to aid, debt, especially as relates to Africa. We're engaging with them and many others as well too, because they speak to all sides, and there's a good connection they have to the conservative community here as well in the US, which is helpful and have been helpful for at least saving some of these programs that you've seen that haven't been cut. But it's also an opening. And when it comes to leverage, you need to go where that leverage is and where that power is. That's helpful. With Uganda itself, it's interesting because we were strategizing about this a few weeks ago to see what can we actually do. Because Uganda is a security ally of the United States, how Museveni will play his cards. And so he sees what's happening in Tanzania. Now he's not worried with what's going to happen next month. They've already put Bessie J in jail. You see how they've split opposition, what will happen with Bobby and others. And so we anticipate Museveni is going to go, he might beat Bia's record, right? And so we know what's going to take place next month. I think what's important here is there is still a pro-democracy force that's looking to address what's taking place. Sometimes we don't always have to look at the US for leadership. And that's an important thing I want for you all to also take from here is that, and this is what we're seeing within the multilateral space, but also the peace and security, peacefulness space, all spaces, is maybe it's time for some new leadership as well, and not trying to force and figure out ways to only have the US to pay attention to the issues on the ground. There's a few European countries that are already taking particular attention to the situation in Uganda. I know they are already on Tanzania, but it's also time for the multilateral system and even the African system, the African Union, ACPHR and others to really stand up for, in terms of the right way. Now, as you know, that's difficult and unlikely to take place, but that's where we're looking at for alternative solutions at this time. And then just Brian, how can we highlight waste, fraud, and abuse without undermining this international multilateral system? It's a tough question. It's a tough question, but it's the right question because not addressing this in the past, I feel, has led to the big changes that we're seeing now, but also the popular narrative against aid. And this is not only what we're seeing here, but across Europe, where now you really have to make the case to the taxpayer why aid is in your best interests. And so I don't have a good answer for you on how to do this, other than it is important that it's done, because any new system will have to have these kind of checks and balances in place.
Jonathan? Yeah, on that, this is a question we're asked a lot about, because it's a challenge when you talk about corruption and combating it, you're also exposing it, and particularly when it's in governance, when there's already erosion, significant erosion of trust in governance. Yeah, this kind of highlights the point, and it turns people away, citizens from public from wanting to engage in democracies. But I would agree too, this is really important. Whether you call this 1.5, when it's important, one, to expose the fraud, waste, and abuse. Unfortunately, there's still some inspector generals, I might say a few across the US government. We focused on the loss of several across key departments and agencies. USAID still has, I think it's a remnant of what that was. People are still working on, fraud, waste, and abuse. It's very unlikely in sort of the current administration that people are going to step up and step forward, whistleblowers. So what you really need is in country, you need continued independent media, investigative journalism. We talked a little bit about the report highlights the impact of cuts on independent media. Investigative journalism is particularly important in exposing fraud, waste, and abuse. But it really requires civil society, and it should remain a priority, even if it muddies the water. We need to think about how we uphold rule of law and not step back from that. And so it's really important. I've spent more time trying to unroot what's taking place, and there are a number of organizations that are tracking waste, fraud, and abuse, both domestically in the U.S., connected to government, and those probably less so looking externally. But I think, I think the visit to the White House over the last couple of days highlights, really sort of the potential threat when you have non-democratic actors pledging to provide $1 billion or $1 trillion in investment. What does that mean for the United States, and where?
Great. Annika and Susanna, anybody with some final thoughts addressing those questions and helping us close down?
Yeah, if these are the final thoughts, I mean, just picking up on the questions that were made and also some of the comments that were made. I mean, the point on monitoring how aid going forward here, US aid going forward is used and who it goes to. I think luckily there's still a vibrant civil society here in the US. There's still investigative journalists, even if the big media companies are caving in. And so I think that it will, in the absence of those formal checks that have many of them being removed within the within the formal institutions and democratic institutions, civil society will have to play a much bigger role in monitoring how those that money is spent. And I don't know how the aid, not the aid flows, it's not aid flows, but the grant making to American civil society organizations working on democracy and governance domestically, how if they are increasing now. From my LinkedIn account, it seems like they are, and that can strengthen American civil society with each other. So a big responsibility in the absence of those formal checks for civil society to play an important role. I also wanted to pick up on one of the comments that Kizito made in terms of, yes, the US was the strongest and most vocal and most powerful defender of democratic norms globally. Now it has retreated, but that also opens up a space and an opportunity for other countries to occupy that space. And I was saying that in my presentation. Let's hope that it's democratic actors and countries that occupy that space. And here I just wanted to end by mentioning International IDEA. We are an intergovernmental organization, actually, with 35 member states, democracies from all over the world. And so even though we're thinking and do tech and we provide capacity building to civil society organizations around the world, and we do policy research, an important part of our role is also to engage our member states in support of democracy, and even more importantly so in this context. So, and our Global South member states have been much less vocal than our European member states. The US is not a member state. So it's European member states and Global South member states. And the European member states are also foreign aid donors. And they have been the most engaged in IDEA. Now we're trying to engage the Global South democracies, and we're seeing very positive signals. We just had an event during UNGA to celebrate our 30th anniversary, where we invited all our member states, and we had countries that had previously been quite passive in IDEA coming forward and saying they wanted to talk, they wanted to co-support the event with us. And we had South Africa, we had Ghana, we had Mongolia, Chile at the ministerial level engaging in our event and publicly supporting democracy, and also seeming to willing to play a role in supporting it in the region or globally, but very much according to their own terms. Also emphasizing also that democracy looks different in different places, and that a key element for them is that democracy delivers, and that it's not just a set of political rights, but also a set of economic and social rights. So I think that
hopefully we can continue to engage them and the democracy conversation might look a little bit different with them engaged going forward. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to work with you. Susanna, you want to close down?
Sure. I think, first of all, this has been really fascinating and also kind of a struggle. And so I'm going to name the struggle for me a little bit here, is that we're watching this destruction happen, right? And we're looking for some kind of solution. And yet who the we is really not clear. Like, who is the actor that is finding the solution? Maybe there are one or two in this room, but the reality is that the actors who are finding the solution are elsewhere right now. And so I think part of the question is, how are we getting out of our familiar spaces and places and engaging outside? So a big question for me with the private sector right now is, how is risk calculation going to change? Because it's going to have to, right? That the whole model of how private sectors have thought about their investment strategies in a space where they can be guaranteed a certain type of stability, with the current trends and the likely escalation of violence, I mean, all of those trends are going in the wrong direction. That's going to have to change. And so I don't have kind of a hopeful message. Unfortunately, Carl, I am a researcher at heart and I have like an empirical message, which is that we have to understand much better what is going on. And Kizito, a lot of the examples that you've put on the table begin to illustrate these kind of patterns and trends and how adaptation is happening. And then how to work with that, how to plug into it, how to go work with people who you didn't think you wanted to, could, or should work with. And I think that's the space where this field is going. And I think that's what we all need to lean into more. And so thank you, Annika, for all of the work that you all did to set this out, to help us think about how to move forward.
All right, thank you so much, Susanna, and Kizito, and Jonathan, and Annika, and thank you all in the audience for hanging in there and for coming and joining us in the School of International Service tonight. Thanks.